My name is Theodore Schubot. Usually I go by Ted. I was raised in Northern California, and my father was Muslim when I was born. My mother was Catholic, and when they were married, there was like all sorts of theological arguments that took place, and then eventually my dad started reading the Bible and realized that it was superior to the Quran. And that's a long story unto itself. But my father started to attend a Baptist church. He thought about Catholicism, but he was always very resistant to Catholicism because of the icons and the statues. That's one thing that he always found to be like super uncomfortable, and that's because of his Islamic upbringing. Islam is very iconoclastic, so icons are always seen as idols. It's a very Protestant position. So anyway, my father found more familiarity with the Protestant church, so he started going to this Baptist church, and I was like 4 or 5 years old at the time. And we attended this Baptist church for over a decade. I remember we were very loyal to this church, and then it was like new leadership happened, and they started preaching some weird stuff, started doing things like praying over crystals, and it started becoming very new agey. So we left that church and we ended up going to a non-denominational evangelical church, and we went there for a few years, and it was actually nice. It was friendly and everything like that. But I was always seeking something deeper. I'm the kind of person that if I want to learn about something, I always want to look at the primary sources. So if I'm interested in, for example, an historical event, I want to read the primary source accounts, right? So it's like, okay, I want to read about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. I'm going to read what people wrote at that time, conquistadors who were in Mexico. So I was always very interested in history, and at a young age, I really got into history. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I started really researching Christianity. Started really reading up on different things and reading up about different religions. I read about Mormonism. I read about Buddhism. I got into Scientology. I never became a Scientologist, but I read a lot about Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard. I just got into all that stuff. And I became very fascinated by religion. I became very fascinated with ideology. And the reason for this is because ideology is what dictates society, how people view the world, how people view humanity, how the perspective of a society is what determines how that society comes out. And it all starts from within. It all starts from within all of us collectively. So I was very interested in religion and very interested in ideology and how it affects the world. So when I was a junior in high school, I started really thinking to myself, because I got into classical music when I was in high school. I got into Baroque music, and I really got into Vivaldi and Bach and Pachelbel, and I got into all of these different composers. And I remember going to a wedding and hearing Pachelbel's canon, and I was like, I need to know the name of this piece. And I remember I just couldn't stop listening to it, and people were like, it's a wedding song. But it's like, no, it's not really a wedding song. It's used for weddings, but it's just the perfect piece of music. So I really wanted to get into literature, like spiritual literature, like deep literature, because I got into good music and this very beautiful classical music, but I wanted to get into that, but in the literary form of it. So it's like I really got interested in the history of Christianity, right? Because I was reading the Gospels, and I read the book of Revelation from beginning to end. I read the Gospels. I was reading a lot of the New Testament. But I wanted to dig more, like, okay, what happens after the New Testament? Right? Like, because you have Jesus, you have the 12 disciples, you read the book of Acts, and the book of Acts is basically our earliest text for church history, right? I mean, you have the Gospels for the life of Christ, but after Christ, you have the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is your first record of ecclesiastical history after the resurrection. And so I read that, and I remember thinking, I want to know what happens after Acts. What happened after that? What happened after Paul? Where did it go? Because do we go from the book of Acts to a non-denominational church, or like, what happened in between all that? So I started reading. I found this book. My father, because he had converted to Christianity from Islam, and because my father, when he was a Muslim, my father actually was a terrorist. He was a failed terrorist. He wasn't a sophisticated terrorist, and he's proud to say that he was not a sophisticated terrorist. He just to make a long story short, he got into when my father was a teenager living in the West Bank, which is AKA Palestine, where the Palestinians live. My father was very idealistic as a teenager, and he wanted to fight for Islam. And what's interesting is that this was at a time in the 70s, and so the 70s there was radicalism, but I don't think it was as big as it is now at that time. But my father took part in a lot of demonstrations against the Israeli government, and then he ended up getting arrested because he partook in demonstrations, and then he got sentenced to prison for like a month or something. And my father can tell you if you want to talk to him, but yeah, he was in prison for a while, for a number of weeks. But because my father's mom was an American from California, my father's half American, the embassy kind of got involved and things like that, and then eventually he was released. So then, while he was in prison, he made friends with a terrorist, a serious terrorist of North African descent. His last name was Mughrabi. I forgot his first name, but Mughrabi was his last name. And Mughrabi was, he was kind of like a gang leader. He was older, he was more experienced, and he was a hardened criminal. And he told my father that he could connect him with terrorists so that he could participate in jihad against the Israelis. So when my father got out of prison, he started connecting with Mughrabi's people, and they said, okay, here's the operation. So Mughrabi was operating this, and Mughrabi's gang of terrorists gave my father a bomb. And they said, we want you to take this bomb and put it in a bank and full of Israelis. So my father got the bomb, and there was a timer set on it, and he had to put that bomb in there before the timer went off, or else he would have blown up with the bomb. So my father went to the bank, and he had this oh my God, what am I doing moment? Like, I'm going to murder people. What the hell? He had this moment right there. His consciousness spoke to him. It's like, what are you doing? And he saw a child walking in front of the bank, and he's like, he went into shock. So my father just tossed the bomb onto the roof of the bank and ran, and the bomb blew up. And my father went home, and my father was stuck in bed for days in depression because he had this feeling that he had murdered somebody. So he was in depression for days, and then the news broke out about the bombing, and he heard about the news and said no one died. And my father was like, my father was so relieved that nobody died. And he just was like, I'm done with it. I don't want to put bombs. I don't want to do that stuff. But my father still remained a Muslim, and then eventually converted to Christianity in 1993 when I was 3 years old. So because my father was talking about Islam in the 90s, my father started telling people about Islam at the Baptist church that we were attending. And this was before 9/11, so people were thinking, oh, what's Islam? Like, people didn't even know what Islam was in the 90s, right? They were like, we've never heard of that, blah, blah, blah. That's all, like, who cares? And at that time, in the early 90s, the American churches were more focused on preaching to Mormons or debating with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. They didn't really know anything about Islam. Then 9/11 came. 9/11 came, and the two towers fell. And our whole life changed after that because everyone in the media was, searching the internet for anyone who knew about Islam because no one talked about Islam that much. So my father all of a sudden is getting phone calls, people asking him, because my father started a website, and he was writing articles about Islam back in the 90s. So they found my dad's articles. They wrote him. They're like, can you come on the radio? Can you come on? So my dad was going on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, BBC, like all these big media outlets were inviting my father. And this went on for many, many years. My father was very busy. And my father spoke in all these different universities, and numerous universities actually all throughout the world. And so my dad was talking a lot about Islam. So I started researching Islam, and I read a lot about Islam. And when I was in high school, I read a lot about Islam, but I started looking into other religions. And my father, while he was doing his work, made friends with a professor by the name of Alvin Schmidt, Professor Schmidt. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but Schmidt was a professor for Concordia University in Missouri. Very educated man. And he wrote 2 books. One was called The Great Divide, which was a comparison made between Christianity and Islam. And then he wrote another book called How Christianity Changed the World. How Christianity Changed the World became kind of I don't know if it was a bestseller. I think it became something of a bestseller, or at least a little bit under a bestseller. But that book launched his career as an author, really. And because my dad was friends with him, because my father spoke at the church that Professor Schmidt was attending. I think my dad also spoke at Concordia University. I don't remember, but Schmidt gave my father the 2 books. So my dad comes back home and he gives me the 2 books. So I started reading The Great Divide, but then I started reading How Christianity Changed the World. And in this book, Professor Schmidt, who was a Lutheran, he wasn't even a Catholic, but Professor Schmidt started quoting all these church fathers because he got into church history in the book, because the name of the book is How Christianity Changed the World. So I'm reading this book, and I'm reading about Chrysostom, and I'm reading about Lactantius, and I'm reading about Tertullian, and I'm reading about Augustine, and I'm reading about all these ancient Christian scholars and writers who I had never even heard of. So I'm thinking, okay, who are these people? I want to read their books. So I started reading, and this was back in high school. After I got out of high school, I started purchasing ancient books. So I remember I had this coin jar, and it was like $200 worth of coins that I had been saving up for years. And I converted it into cash, and I went to a Barnes & Noble's bookstore, and I bought Herodotus's Histories. And then eventually I started purchasing Christian books, ancient Christian books. So I read Lactantius, and I got Tertullian, I got some of Chrysostom, I got Justine Martyr, and I got all of these ancient Christian writers, and I started just reading them all. And I especially loved reading Tertullian, even though Tertullian kind of went down a different road later on in his life. You know, he became a heretic. But nonetheless, before that, he wrote some really good stuff, like Apologia, and he wrote stuff on the gladiatorial matches and things like that. And he really provides a lot of deep, rich history on paganism, but also on the contention or the struggle between paganism and Christianity. And so by reading him, you get this very clear view on the differences between Christianity and paganism. And that's what really interested me. So one night I'm reading Tertullian, and this is after, so I'm reading the church fathers, reading all this stuff. And then in the year 2013, so from high school all the way into the year 2013, I'm reading this stuff. And 2013, I remember I found this book, and it's by Tertullian, and it was called On Heresies. So Tertullian writes a small book on what is heresy. He defines heresy, and he talks about how to recognize heresy. How do you recognize heretical groups? And Tertullian says you have to look at the records. Look at the records of a church. The church needs to show that it has apostolic succession. And this is what clicked in my mind, apostolic succession. So can you trace your church from Jesus to now? And then Tertullian says that the Roman church can trace its origin all the way back to Christ, and from Christ to bishops Paul and Peter. And I started reading, but it was just amazing to me. Like, wow, this is it right here. Because I was reading, I read Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, and Eusebius talks. He goes from the time of Christ to the apostles, going all the way up until Constantine. And I read Eusebius's Life of Constantine, which was a beautiful book on Constantine and how righteous he was. Because for years, I had heard that Constantine was an evil tyrant and all this stuff. But then when you read Lactantius's biography of Constantine, or when you read Eusebius's biography, you get a completely different picture. You read about Constantine fighting the pagans. You read about Constantine saving the persecuted church, who was being massacred by the tens of thousands in Rome by the pagan government. And that's what really attracted me. What attracted me, what pulled me in, wasn't the liturgy, although the liturgy is important, don't get me wrong, but it was this rich history of fighting evil. And that's what got me. Like, I really love that militant spirit of Christianity. The militancy of Christianity, I think, is something that is missing so much today. When I was in high school, even though I wasn't Catholic and I wasn't planning on becoming Catholic when I was in high school, nonetheless, I was reading the Bible a lot. And I would read in the Bible about how, so-and-so would overthrow this idol, Gideon would overthrow this idol. And then you go into the book of Acts and you read about how the Christians burned books on astronomy or astrology, and Jesus fought against the merchants and all this stuff. And you're like, wow, Christianity is a very militant religion. So I remember when I was in high school, I really wanted to be militant. I really wanted that militant spirit. And I listened to a lot of POD, which is a Christian rock band. They talked about revolution, and it was very militant. So I like that. I love that spirit, and I still do. And I remember going into my high school library and seeing all these weird books, it was homosexual stuff, and there was Nietzsche and Darwinistic stuff, and there's a lot of weird stuff in the library. And I remember just taking all these books and throwing them in the trash. And I remember going into physics class, and the physics teacher that I had, this was when I was a senior in high school, she was very anti-Christian, and she had a big giant poster on the wall, I remember. And on the poster, it said, how the world began. This is what the poster said. And it said, the world begins with the Big Bang, and then you have a giant swamp, and then you have a single-celled organism, and from that single-cell organism, all these different life forms come up. So I remember asking her, I said, okay, what happens before all of this stuff? What happens? What started all of this? And she said, well, it started out with a singular cell. So she said, it started out with organisms in a swamp. Okay, what came before that? Well, it started out with there was a Big Bang or whatever. Okay, what started before that? Well, we really don't know. I said, so okay, you have faith that all this happened. I said, well, I think that God created the whole world. I think God created the universe. But you believe that everything started out with a random explosion, and then all of this complexity, manifested itself. And we got into this argument, and she said, keep your religion outside the classroom, she told me. And I remember when she left the classroom, I took the poster and I walked out of the room and I threw it in the trash. And I was this was my way of showing my militancy, And I remember eventually I got caught, and
did it make a big bang when you threw it in the garbage can? Did it make a big bang?
Yeah. Well, I eventually got caught. One of the principals came up to me, because I had a friend who was he wasn't a Christian, but he thought it was really cool that I was stealing books and throwing them in the trash. So he's like, this is awesome, because I think he just liked the idea of destroying property. So we had this plan that we were going to steal a whole bunch of books in the library, because I had analyzed all the books, not all of them, but I analyzed a bunch of books in the library. I'm like, hey, this needs to go, this needs to go. I was doing my own inquisition. And I said, okay, let's steal these books in the morning before school starts. We'll put them all in our backpacks or whatever, in bags. We'll find a way to hide, to keep them, to store them. We'll take them to some empty place somewhere, and we'll light them on fire. We were gonna pour gasoline on them and light them on and have a book burning session. That's what we were gonna do. And I remember going to the library that morning, and then there was a guy there waiting for me. And he's like, "Is your name Ted?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Come with me." So I remember going to the office, sitting down, and there was like 4 people there. There was the principal, and there were like 2 vice principals there, and there was a school counselor. And they said, "Well, why did you throw all the books in the trash?" And I said, "Because those books don't belong here." I said, "You have a book on homosexuality. You have Nietzsche. You have all this weird stuff going on." And I said, "Those books don't belong there." And they all looked at each other and they realized, okay, this guy is some kind of an ideologue. He's not a troublemaker or whatever. He just has some convictions. And they said, okay, well, listen. They said, we're just gonna suspend you from the library for the rest of the year. And hold on a second. I'm hearing a strange noise. Anyway. So anyway, sorry, I heard something that got distracted me. The principal had a talk with me, and he said, "Okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to donate books to the library." And I said, "Okay, fine. I'll be happy to do that." And he said to me, "You have a fire inside of you." And he says, "Don't let anyone ever take it away from you." And I never forgot that. So I still have this belief in the militant spirit of Christianity.